and feeble thing. But it was all he had. He and his few little allies of a desert which fought only to keep its solitude. Repatriated slaves had told him of the Earthlings' power. Their roaring machines filled the silence of their own deserts, gouged the quiet face of their own moon, shook the planets with a senseless fury of meaningless energy. They were the conquerors, and it never occurred to them that an ancient peace and stillness could be worth preserving. Well, he fitted an arrow to the string and crouched in the silent, flimmering sunlight, waiting. The hound came first, yelping and howling. Kreega drew the bow as far as he could, but the human had to come near first. There he came, running and bounding over the rocks, rifle in hand and restless eyes shining with taut green light, closing in for the death. Kreega swung softly around. The beast was beyond the rock now, the Earthman almost below it. The bow twanged. With a savage thrill, Kreega saw the arrow go through the hound, saw the creature leap in the air and then roll over and over, howling and biting at the thing in its breast. Like a gray thunderbolt, the Martian launched himself off the rock, down at the human. If his axe could shatter that helmet! He struck the man, and they went down together. Wildly, the Martian hewed. The axe glanced off the plastic. He hadn't had room for a swing. Riordan roared and lashed out with a fist. Retching, Kreega rolled backward. Riordan snapped a shot at him. Kreega turned and fled. The man got to one knee, sighting carefully on the gray form that streaked up the nearest slope. A little sand snake darted up the man's leg and wrapped about his wrist. Its small strength was just enough to pull the gun aside. The bullet screamed past Kreega's ear as he vanished into a cleft. He felt the thin death agony of the snake as the man pulled it loose and crushed it underfoot. Somewhat later, he heard a dull boom echoing between the hills. The man had gotten explosives from his boat and blown up the tower. He had lost axe and bow. Now he was utterly weaponless, without even a place to retire for a last stand. And the hunter would not give up. Even without his animals, he would follow, more slowly, but as relentlessly as before. Kreega collapsed on a shelf of rock. Dry sobbing racked his thin body, and the sunset wind cried with him. Presently he looked up across a red and yellow immensity to the low sun. Long shadows were creeping over the land. Peace and stillness for a brief moment before the iron cold of night closed down. Somewhere the soft trill of a sand runner echoed between low, wind-worn cliffs, and the brush began to speak, whispering back and forth in its ancient wordless tongue. The desert, the planet and its wind and sand under the high cold stars, the clean open land of silence and loneliness and a destiny which was not man's spoke to him. The enormous oneness of life on Mars, drawn together against the cruel environment, stirred in his blood. As the sun went down and the stars blossomed forth in awesome frosty glory, Kreega began to think again. He did not hate his persecutor, but the grimness of Mars was in him. He fought the war of all, which was old and primitive and lost in its own dreams, against the alien and the desecrator. It was as ancient and pitiless as life, that war, and each battle won or lost meant something, even if no one ever heard of it. "You do not fight alone," whispered the desert. "You fight for all Mars, and we are with you." Something moved in the darkness, a tiny warm form running across his hand. A little feathered mouse-like thing that burrowed under the sand and lived its small fugitive life, and was glad in its own way of living. But it was a part of a world, and Mars has no pity in its voice. Still, a tenderness was within Kreega's heart, and he whispered gently in the language that was not a language. "You will do this for us? You will do it, little brother?" Riordan was too tired to sleep well. He had lain awake for a long time thinking, and that is not good for a man alone in the Martian hills. So now the rockhound was dead too. It didn't matter. The owlie wouldn't escape. But somehow the incident brought home to him the immensity and the age and loneliness of the desert. It whispered to him. The brush rustled and something wailed in darkness, and the wind blew with a wild, mournful sound over faintly starlit cliffs. And it was as if they all somehow had voice, as if the whole world muttered and threatened him in the night. Dimly he wondered if man would ever subdue Mars, if the human race had not finally run across something bigger than itself. But that was nonsense. Mars was old and worn out and barren, dreaming itself into slow death. The tramp of human feet, shouts of men, and roar of sky-storming rockets were waking it, but to a new destiny, to man's. When Ares lifted its hard spires above the hills of Syrtis, where then were the ancient gods of Mars? It was cold, and the cold deepened as the night wore on. The stars were fire and ice, glittering diamonds in the deep crystal dark. Now and then he could hear a faint snapping borne through the earth as rock or tree split open. The wind laid itself to rest. Sound froze to death. There was only the hard, clear starlight falling through space to shatter on the ground. Once something stirred. He woke from a restless sleep and saw a small thing skittering toward him. He groped for the rifle beside his sleeping bag, then laughed harshly. It was only a sand mouse. But it proved that a Martian had no chance of sneaking up on him while he rested. He didn't laugh again. The sound had echoed too hollowly in his helmet. With the clear, bitter dawn, he was up. He wanted to get the hunt over with. He was dirty and unshaven inside the unit, sick of iron rations pushed through the airlock, stiff and sore with exertion. Lacking the hound, which he had to shoot, tracking would be slow, but he didn't want to go back to Port Armstrong for another. No, he'll take that Martian. He'd have the devil's skin soon. Breakfast and a little moving made him feel better. He looked with a practiced eye for the Martian's trail. There was sand and brush over everything. Even the rocks had a thin coating of their own erosion. The owlie couldn't cover his tracks perfectly. If he tried, it would slow him too much. Riordan fell into a steady jog. Noon found him on higher ground, rough hills with gaunt needles of rock reaching yards into the sky. He kept going, confident of his own ability to wear down the quarry. He'd run deer to earth back home, day after day, until the animal's heart broke and it waited quivering for him to come. The trail looked clear and fresh now. He tensed with the knowledge that the Martian couldn't be far away. Too clear. Could this be bait for another trap? He hefted the rifle and proceeded more warily. But no, there wouldn't have been time. He mounted a high ridge and looked over the grim, fantastic landscape. Near the horizon he saw a blackened strip, the border of his radioactive barrier. The Martian couldn't go further, and if he doubled back, Riordan would have an excellent chance of spotting him. He tuned up his speaker and let his voice roar into the stillness. "Come out, owlie. I'm going to get you. You might as well come out now and be done with it." The echoes took it up, flying back and forth between the naked crags, trembling and shivering under the brassy arch of sky. "Come out! Come out! Come out!" The Martian seemed to appear from thin air, a gray ghost rising out of the jumbled stones and standing poised not 20 feet away. For an instant the shock of it was too much. Riordan gaped in disbelief. Kreega waited, quivering ever so faintly, as if he were a mirage. Then the man shouted and lifted his rifle. Still the Martian stood there, as if carved in gray stone, and with a shock of disappointment Riordan thought that he had, after all, decided to give himself to an inevitable death. Well, it had been a good hunt. "So long," whispered Riordan, and squeezed the trigger. Since the sand mouse had crawled into the barrel, the gun exploded. Riordan heard the roar and saw the barrel peel open like a rotten banana. He wasn't hurt, but as he staggered back from the shock, Kreega lunged at him. The Martian was 4 feet tall and skinny and weaponless, but he hit the Earthling like a small tornado.